This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
It's the left versus the right. In the right corner, it's James Flippin. In the left corner, it's Governor David Paterson. Live from Studio 77, it's a 77 WABC debate.
And welcome into the left versus the right. I am James Flippin on the right, and on the left, my buddy David Paterson, the former governor of New York and also a regular contributor on Katz and Cosby weeknights here at 77 WABC. Here on the left versus the right, we get into all the big news items, all the top political stories, even stuff that's not necessarily political, but we kind of take a look at it in that political paradigm you know so well, the left versus the right, the blue versus the red. So, Governor Paterson, great to have you back. It's I guess they like it
that I'm dressed in blue.
You are wearing blue.
Yes.
I also am wearing blue, but I think that in some ways your blue is a little bit more
more radical.
Yes, more leftist. More puts me in mind of Karl Marx and such, and that's making me comfortable right now. So, okay. But speaking of issues that certainly fall along the political divide these days, why not get right into it? It was fiery yesterday. It was intense. It was must-watch TV. It was all that as President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine was in Washington, D.C., to talk with President Trump, talk with Vice President J.D. Vance. They were supposed to sign a rare earth minerals deal and potentially kind of continue this push for peace between Ukraine and Russia, but it didn't quite go that way. It was a disagreement, I guess I will say, between Zelensky and between Trump. Now, personally, I'll say this, Governor Paterson, and I want to get your take on it. I am a big fan of this tactic that Trump is taking, because no matter how you slice it, and I'm no military expert, I'm certainly not reporting from anywhere on the ground in Ukraine or in Russia, but it seems as though it's kind of an unwinnable war for Ukraine. It's an ongoing stalemate, if nothing else, that's being funded by the taxpayer dollars here in the U.S., the blood that's being flown and the bloodshed that's happening at the hands of Ukraine and Russia. And it's sort of just an ongoing quagmire that the only thing that can happen is for somebody like the U.S. to say, this can't continue. So I want to get your take on it. I want to get into why this seems to be such an important cause for the left in terms of standing up for Ukraine in particular, and allow you to kind of expand on some of that.
Well, the incident itself reminds me of something that happened a few weeks ago. Remember that Rudy Giuliani did not come up with what the court ordered him to in the lawsuit that he lost against the poll workers down in Georgia. Mm-hmm. And, was grinding along. And I think that those poll workers, through their attorneys, realized we're going to be fighting this for 3 years. Each year we get older, and each year it's going to be more of a strain to go through this. We can beat him, but he's made it so it's going to take us a while to beat him. So they settled. They got $150 million. They can invest it and be who knows where in 3 years. And I thought that was a very wise move they made. So I kind of thought this week that Zelensky would take that same tact, because he can't win. It's not like he's going to conquer Russia. He's not going to drive Russia out of the Ukraine. And he's going to lose territories in Ukraine if he keeps this war going. And he's already lost some. So I thought this was really a very clever idea that President Trump or whoever advised him to make the deal about the minerals and the development and that kind of thing. And in that respect, you buy peace. And peace is that the U.S. will now react a little differently if Russia comes in there again, because we have an interest there. I thought it was all set up, didn't really think much about it, went to work, and then later on yesterday afternoon, you told me what actually did happen. And I thought, wow, what a confrontation.
For sure. And like I said at the front end, definitely something that kind of you couldn't take your eyes away from it, sort of a little bit of a train wreck, kind of awkward and embarrassing to watch them both arguing with each other on the world stage like that. But
the little part I saw, I thought, wait a minute, Donald Trump has imitated a lot of people, but now he's imitating Jerry Springer.
Yeah, well, I mean, but you're right, and I think that here's the thing. I don't know what to make of this whole situation, Governor, because for me, it's kind of like I have to wonder what's really going through Zelensky's head here. Now, it would be easy enough to say that he's ungrateful, that he's arrogant, that he's a moron, that he's got no idea what he's doing, that he's way in over his head. Potentially all that's true. But there's another aspect of it that makes me think, is there potentially more to this here, right? Like, we've talked a lot about how Ukraine is well known, infamous even, for its corruption and for the various kind of difficult aspects of state making that have gone on there over the last 10 years. And even Trump has been critical, saying Zelensky suspended elections, which is absolutely true. Of course, it's a time of war, so that's not necessarily the craziest thing ever. But the amount of money that's flown into Ukraine over the last 4 years, let's say, and okay, more specifically 3 since the war started, is nothing short of staggering. I mean, you're talking $200 billion. And whenever there's that much money involved, I can't help but wonder what is really going on there, how much of that money is getting into the hands where it's supposed to go, how much of these different companies that are making the bombs and the missiles and the jets are, in essence, kind of making sure that money continues to flow. And is there pressure from outside the whole situation on Zelensky not to sign this deal? I'm not even sure what that would really be. Like, would that be some sort of NGO that's pressuring him not to sign it? Is there someone deep within the CIA who's telling him not? Granted, this is not the Roger Stone show. We're not trying to get into pure conspiracy theory here. But I am curious, like, what do you think the motivation is? Do you think Zelensky is basically just saying that he can't in good conscience actually sign that mineral rights deal because he thinks it's a screw job for his people?
I really find what you've said quite interesting, because I assumed that Zelensky would, have our protection and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But U.S. involvement isn't just to go pick up some diamonds and make rings out of them. Mm-hmm. It's also observing what the government's doing. And if you're fighting corruption that you believe is in the government here in the United States, mm-hmm. how could you sit back and not say anything when the Ukrainians go about their business and, the corruption and everything that you mentioned?
And not to mention, Governor, and this is the left versus the right. I'm James Flippin on the right. That's Governor Paterson, Democrat, former governor who is of the left here. You invoked the name Rudy Giuliani. And it was just kind of as a unique and convenient example in terms of like the turf war between plaintiffs and defendants in a civil action. But you're making the comparison, a very good one, I think, to what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Let's not forget that President Trump was literally impeached for asking questions about some of the corruption in Ukraine during his first term. So it's not such a far-flung idea that potentially he is saying, hey, this is going to have to be the type of situation where we're seeing some contrition here on the one side, or else we're not really confident that this is what we need in terms of a trading partner, in terms of a partner going forward. In other words, yes, we want to make the deal for peace. We want the bullets to stop flying, the bloodshed to stop. That's the most important thing. But there is some level of concern, I think, with whatever the future is going to be for Ukraine, especially because, and you made the good point earlier, of kind of saying that under the current potential framework for a peace deal, the U.S. is almost like a stand-in for NATO, right? If it's a 50-50 deal on this mineral rights and deep earth and development, then yeah, the U.S. has an especially vested interest in the security and protection and future of Ukraine.
Exactly.
NATO, I guess, wouldn't be involved then in that deal, which is something Russia's been hardline on.
I didn't hear the whole presentation. What was Zelensky's argument? Because to me, I thought he had a good deal. Go sign your name and go home and go back to whatever it is you do.
Well, I mean, look, there's a few things to keep in mind. One, the the joint press conference that they were supposed to have, sort of standing alongside each other at the White House where they can answer questions from press, never actually happened, right? So they canceled that after it was sort of more the scrum where they were sitting along with each other, and it's supposed to be, generally speaking, like a photo op, right?
Right.
And they kind of started getting into it right then and there. And from what I heard from Zelensky, because it's kind of hard to make sense of it, right? They're both talking at the same time. They're talking over each other. From what I can hear from Zelensky, he's more or less saying that's not true, what you guys are making it out to be, that we're not grateful of the support that we've received from the U.S., that we're not interested in continuing to further this relationship or whatever. He was sort of saying that's not, and then you had even Vice President J.D. Vance interjecting and saying, I haven't heard you once throughout this meeting say that you have any level of grace or appreciation for. Now, some of that is going to kind of fall back into what I think many on the left consider to be the worst natures of President Trump, right? Like, thou shalt bend the knee to the power structure here, and you're going to have to kiss my ring in order to get things done. But do you think that that's really what this is? Or do you think it's sort of, because you've often talked about that you respect the aspect of negotiation that Trump has often put forth, not just in politics, but even beforehand. So, I mean, what do you make of the president, and I'm talking about Trump in this sense, his position, and sort of maybe continuously sort of driving a wedge here between U.S. and the Ukraine side while trying to cozy up to the Russia side to potentially make a ceasefire?
Thanks to you, James, even if you are on the right, for, in a way, clearing that up for me, because for what the United States is giving to do this, and then they have a meeting and Zelensky's there as if, they never had a negotiation, I can see why the president and the vice president lost it with him, and why the vice president said, I didn't hear, you didn't say anything about caring about what we're doing here. And that can happen where you just think you have this good deal and you go to negotiation to settle it, and then the other side either doesn't appreciate your participation or doesn't say what you thought they would, and now you have what they call, Paul Newman called, a failure to communicate.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking and it's tragic in the sense that all the while people are continuing to die out on the battlefield, and that's obviously something that nobody wants to see continuing to happen. But if I could just shift gears a little bit, because while we try to read the tea leaves and make sense of this very high stakes, very real world negotiation and attempt to bring a resolution to a conflict, I'm struck by the thing that kind of sticks out in my mind, Governor Paterson, which is, maybe you can help me to understand this as well. The American left, the political left, and not just people on the left, people on the right as well, but especially people on the left, have really rallied to the cause of Ukraine here, right? You've seen it especially early on where people would have it in their social media profile with a picture of the flag. Some people continuously wearing it on the lapel.
On both sides, which is very interesting.
And I think that was something that eventually kind of started to wear itself down a little bit on the right, maybe as the inflation crisis started to deepen and aspects of government spending were in fact going towards those packages that were going towards Ukraine. But why do you think, and maybe it's from your own personal view or just people on the left that you associate with, why is there such a prioritization and push for representing the Ukrainian side of this ongoing conflict?
It's rather interesting because usually people on what we will call the left are, peaceniks.
Sure.
They don't want any war anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And
the peace sign and the Vietnam
sign,
and
unless it's on college campuses, but we'll get to that
we are going to get to that, by the way, and that's a little tease from Governor Paterson there.
And so that's, I think sometimes a flaw where you all of a sudden you're speaking up for the Ukrainians, but nobody from that ilk was speaking for the Ukrainians when this whole situation started 4 or 5 years ago. When it started to move in that direction. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's probably why Zelensky, I guess he's home by now, he's had a whole day, but would stop and think, oh no, I'm in a pile of crap, and I just didn't help my situation at all. I mean, I don't see how he can wake up and think any differently than what I just described.
It's kind of fascinating. It makes you think, like, does he feel as though does Zelensky feel as though, and perhaps maybe the conversations he's having behind the scene are such that he thinks that he's going to get an increased level of commitment from his European allies, that, maybe somehow if the situation is kind of like an abandoning of discussions involving the U.S., that maybe that's going to anger Russia and make them want to push towards peace agreements of a different variety. I don't know. I mean, again, like I said, I'm grasping at straws here because I can't imagine where Zelensky felt like he was going to accomplish anything, especially with Trump, by running in there and acting like, you know what, whatever happens, happens. I'm going to get mine. Maybe we'll give you 25% mineral rights, but not the full 50. It's hard for me to make sense of it. It really is.
Well, it was all going his way. The Prime Minister of Great Britain,
Keir Starmer, the day before Thursday,
got involved and pledged their support. Sometimes, James, you don't know when to fold them.
Yeah, look, Governor, honestly, I think, and if you want to talk about it from like the whole Occam's razor way of looking, sometimes the easiest explanation is actually the one that makes the most sense. Maybe Zelensky, who has kind of become a media darling and a big-time star throughout this, in spite of the fact that it's a horrific war in which so many of his people are dying, and clearly he has death threats on his head, no question about that. But maybe he kind of was feeling his britches a little bit too much, and he didn't realize that this was not one he was going to win in this respect.
I remember when, with all the problems that went on in South Africa and inevitably the emergence of Nelson Mandela, that he got this same kind of this tremendous outpouring of support from all different kinds of places.
Right.
Some you wouldn't even expect, but he just kind of kept his cool, ran for president. Didn't pull any further on the strings that were working for him already, and sometimes attention and notoriety can go to your head.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of like President Trump, for example, I've often thought about the fact that, things are difficult for him in some ways in terms of the media landscape within which he plays. By far majority, the big aspects of the press are kind of against him and say that he's Hitler and he's the worst person ever, but that also levels out some of that adulation and adoration that you get from the right, and forces somebody like a Trump and like a Trump White House to be especially light on their feet, especially ready to respond to this attack from this person or this whatever, this media outlet that's going to say you guys are doing it wrong. And a guy like Zelensky, who, again, on the opposite side of the coin, pretty much everybody the world over has made this guy out to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. Maybe he's kind of lost some of his sharpness a little bit on that side of the negotiation and playing the media game.
Yeah, and that's where the interests of the parties gives way to the interest of ego, popularity, notoriety.
And that's the other thing, right? In terms of ego, notoriety, history, legacy, what is the legacy going to be for Vladimir Zelensky if, let's just imagine an end to the conflict, right? Or a sort of a ceasefire where the ground and the land that's been claimed by Russia during this ongoing fight remains theirs. For sure, the Donbas region remains part of Russia. No NATO membership for Ukraine. I hate to say it this way, Governor, because I'm not trying to trivialize people who gave their lives to an armed conflict like this. But in some ways, it's almost like, fine, what did we fight for if that's the result of what is at the end of it? So Zelensky may be looking at it like, I need to throw a Hail Mary here, or else I'm going to look like the guy that kind of just like stood in the way of a potential peace agreement 3 years ago with all this money spent and all these bodies dead 3 years later.
So, James, do you think it's possible that what happened here was that the agreement was put together so quickly and everything was moving so fast that, like you just implied, Zelensky said, oh, wait a minute. What did I do?
Yeah.
somebody who's belligerent in a bar and they wake up the next morning and they've got a knot on their head and they're like, what did I get myself into?
Yeah, what did I drink last night?
Right,
I think you're right. I think that absolutely could be the situation. In essence, the Trump White House and even on the campaign trail made it a really important point of focus that war was going to come to an end. That war was one that never should have happened, that war was something that wouldn't have happened if Trump was still in the White House. He never really spoke about Israel-Hamas the same way.
No.
Right? Like he's often said he wants to see this happen.
That's a much more difficult.
Right. He's floated the idea of even the U.S. being kind of involved in a takeover of Gaza, all that. But you're talking about biblical stuff there, right? The peace in the Middle East. I mean, come on. That's like super hypothetical. This concept of a former Soviet republic fighting with Russia, and it's a little bit of a land border dispute, and hundreds of thousands of people dead, and all this destruction amongst people that in many ways they speak the same language. They're the same type of people.
Yeah.
That one is the one that's especially heartbreaking and especially tough to understand and really has no justification to continue. And I think that's where you're absolutely right. Zelensky may almost feeling a little bit caught off guard in terms of how aggressive within these first 2 months the Trump White House has been in trying to push that forward. You've seen the summit in Saudi Arabia with Marco Rubio.
They're going to be done with me and my country, and they're going to go to the Middle East and build a cultural center.
And he won't be the star anymore,
Right.
and who knows even what his status is going to be, because eventually they'll go back to having, you would think, democratic elections in Ukraine, and that could be the end of Vladimir Zelensky, especially if the people don't like the way the conflict ended. So, all right. A lot more to get into here today. The ongoing push for peace between Russia and Ukraine. We all hope that goes the right way. We're all praying for that to happen, but we'll see. The next thing, bird flu. That's certainly something that we're concerned about, and all the spiking egg prices, the inability to get eggs. If you're a fan of eggs, which who isn't, then that's something that you're worried about. Even just baking, trying to make some cookies. You can't find eggs to do that with. So we're going to talk about that coming back next. It is the left versus the right. He's former New York Governor David Paterson, and I'm James Flippin here on the right.
It's the left versus the right. From Studio 77, it's a 77 WABC debate. 77 WABC.
The left versus the right. He's New York Governor David Paterson on the left, and I'm James Flippin here on the right. It's 77 WABC on your WABC weekend. So maybe this morning, you and the family made some eggs, some scrambled eggs, an omelet, potentially any number of things that you're going to make involving perhaps just an egg wash on your chicken pot pie, for all I know. But it's certainly not so easy to find eggs these days, Governor Paterson, and they're plenty expensive. So do you have any eggs at your house right now?
We have eggs at the house right now.
Do you want to try to put them on sale here on the air? We can take calls and try to raise the price.
We'll try to raise the price. My daughter and her two sons were coming over. They're 6 and 3, and so we thought we'd have eggs for them and bacon and the whole thing.
It's the best.
But, it's costing a little more money. So we considered, but we didn't do it, just kind of withholding the eggs
I can understand that.
Can't afford them right
now. Look,
now.
I mean, this is like, you got to save the top shelf products for
Yes.
a special occasion, a rainy day. So there's been some criticism, and when I was down at the White House, Governor Paterson, a couple weeks ago, there was all these questions from the assembled press there asking White House officials, like, what are you guys going to do differently in responding to this bird flu outbreak than what the Biden White House did? And there was a lot of criticism at that time. These were sort of more Republican or right-leaning reporters saying all the Biden White House did was just kill these flocks, just kill the flock, nothing targeted, nothing more nuanced. And I don't know a lot about responding to bird flu pandemics and, this whole impact on livestock and egg prices. But do you think that there's anything that's fairly or unfairly critical of what the response has been up until this point in terms of the bird flu outbreak and what it's done to egg prices?
I think the criticism has been a little harsh in the sense that this is a healthcare problem, and it's also a disease problem. And in order to solve them, it can't become sort of a political problem. You see what I'm saying? And in that regard, I think that the designated agencies of the federal government and the new administration are doing the best they can to circumvent this. But it's just kind of hard. It appeared that some of these diseases had dwindled and gone away, and then bang, they're back again and in a different part of the country.
Right.
Which is, pretty shocking. I thought that the bird flu problems were out on the West Coast. It was something that happened in the state of Washington and some other places. And then you're hearing about readings in New Jersey. And, so I think what it has done is it has raised the fear factor. And what you hear coming out of the criticism is really the fear.
The fear. And that's certainly relatively understandable coming off the whole COVID thing. I was talking with somebody yesterday here at the station, and they said, this is the next big pandemic, bird flu. And I said, maybe. I mean, look, anytime flu and influenza and really anything virology, you run the risk of it crossing over to the human population. And we have seen some human cases with, bird flu and crossing over. And the first death, I think, was down in Louisiana, right. A guy who was immunocompromised and kind of lived with backyard flocks. And then you've seen some other cases, I think, amongst people who were closely in proximity with some of these birds, but the one death up until this point. So, yeah, I don't know. It's the same thing that's happening with measles right now in Texas. There's a big outbreak there. The bird flu vaccine and ability to vaccinate birds and stuff like that, probably a little bit more on the technical side. But it is kind of interesting to think about in terms of COVID and the loss of trust between the medical establishment and the everyday person, the loss of trust between the state and its authority and the individual amid concerns of health and vaccine and virology and immunization and all this. It's a little tenuous right now. And I can't necessarily hold people accountable for that. Like a friend of mine was saying, I can't believe these people don't vaccinate their kids for measles. And I said, look, people have questions about some of these vaccines right now. You can't just force away people's skepticism or curiosity or wonder, is this the right thing for my kid or my family? And I understand we're getting a little bit away from the bird flu right now, but that's the way I'm looking at this whole question of public health and the interaction between the state and the individual.
Well, as a person who's supposed to be on the left, growing up, and I don't know where I got this from, I was one of those people who liked vitamins. I couldn't stand to go and get a vaccine. I would do it because my parents made me do it.
Now, why was that? You mean you just didn't like the needles? Or?
Well, I don't even think it's that I didn't like the needles. It was just that I wasn't sure how they affect the the virus. And,
so you were looking at it from like a very holistic point of view.
10 or 12 years old, but that's actually how I felt, and went on, to be a person who still has a closet full of vitamins. Yeah, and has had some sympathy for people who have raised that objection, and at first maybe I didn't want it to be politicized. Like if you voted for Trump, then you have to be against vaccines. Yeah. That kind of thing. Yeah. But I do think that we've got to recognize that there are monumental changes now in what goes on in populations because of the population growth, the ability of people to move around, the situations where we have large crowds together. And I think that I would take I took a vaccine for COVID. I took that.
Okay, so you actually answered the question without me even asking it. You must have felt my brainwaves. I was going to say, it's a little bit personal. It's a little bit of a prying question, I guess. But so you did the COVID vaccine, which, by the way, so did I. I took the first COVID vaccine. I never got a booster, whatever. If it was depending on who's listening to the radio right now, I said, ooh, no, but I never got a booster. But I did get the first shot. And in many ways, that was because I kind of felt as though at that time, there was still this idea of solidarity. We're going to beat this thing together.
Right.
We don't want the neighbor down the street who's got cancer to get COVID and die. We don't want grandma to have to worry about whether or not she can or can't come over. We don't want to go get our coworkers sick, all this kind of stuff. And the reporting was that it, in trials, had shown to be an effective vaccine in terms of stopping the spread of the disease.
Right.
Now, sadly, that didn't really kind of bear itself out over time. It's more of like a therapeutic that supposedly keeps you from getting especially ill, and that's especially true for some people as opposed to others. But, yeah, so it sounds like you actually retain a little bit of understanding of some people who are a little bit more skeptical of some of these vaccines.
What I'm going to do, James, I'm going to actually let you take a little break. I'm going to come over to the right and tell you that I don't get the flu. I haven't gotten it since I was a little kid. I don't get the flu.
Have you ever gotten the flu?
Maybe as a little kid.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
But not as an adult that you can
Not
remember.
as an adult.
Yeah.
And I would just fight with my doctors. The flu is 9% effective in, I think it was 2008 or 2009.
Right, you're talking about the vaccine because
Right.
they make a new one every year,
Right.
basically.
Now-
they try to guess.
Yes, and they would say, "You're governor now. What if you got the flu and you got really sick?" I said, "Then I assume at some point I would get over it."
Yeah, right.
And it was just, and finally this person said to me, "Well, look, even if it is only 9% effective, it's 9% more than what you have now." No,
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Right.
And I'll tell you, this was a real issue for me for quite a while. I did think that people went beyond my frustration and sometimes just seemed morally opposed to vaccines, which I just didn't understand.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess, and to be fair, I understand those arguments. Like some people say that there's like stem cell aspects of things or neonatal cells that are used in researching vaccines or in putting together vaccines even. So some people say they're not comfortable with that. That's not even really necessarily where I'm coming from with this. I think that my level of understanding and how it connects back to fear over, let's say, bird flu on both sides, right? The larger outbreak and then potentially what the response from the state would be to that. And then also in terms of measles and some people wondering why don't everybody get their kids vaccinated against measles? I just understand some of that level of skepticism, hesitancy. You can't just force and legislate away people not being clear and having some questions about aspects of medical technology. And, the vaccines, there's still a lot we don't know, for example. And I know this is another thing that's like considered blasphemous these days to say, but in terms of how many times you give kids shots when they're still young or under the 6 months level or 1 year threshold, and the schedule that you give these shots and boom, 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 boom. Some people still say that might have a role to play in autism. So, I mean, we don't know a lot about what we don't know.
Absolutely. I got the vaccines as a small child.
Right.
But I read that some of the vaccines have a shelf life. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, where I am now, I may long since have lost the protection from the measles that I would have had.
Sure. The immunization thing is like almost like sometimes you kind of lose some of that level of protection that you had, like you said, when you first got those vaccines. But it just strikes me that one of the things that is kind of almost a theme of this particular show today, I think, Governor Paterson, is that you noted at the start of the show, sometimes you feel as though there's too much from the left that's almost like a self-righteous, we're not going to even have this debate. We're not even going to get into this discussion. And whether it's the efficacy of vaccines or the potential to have mandates against having them, or you can't go to school without having it, or all this kind of thing. It's almost like for some people on the left, they say, well, that's not even there's no debate. Of course, you have to have those shots, and of course it's understood. It's totally established. And I don't know when that happened, because to me, the concept of being a progressive liberal is saying, well, there's a lot about the world we don't necessarily know.
That's really interesting, James, because back in the, I want to say, 80s, you started to have these companies that would buy time on, stations like WABC and the other stations, and they would have these programs, and they're promoting either a single product or just alternative health.
Yeah.
And they would get blasted, for doing this.
Yeah.
But
you're talking about like taking turmeric or,
exactly.
red beet powder or
oh my God.
Yeah, all that stuff.
And I remember, some of the hosts, they could come on and they would just talk for a whole hour.
Yeah.
The only thing you could do is take notes if you care.
Yeah.
And now, as you said, it's almost reversed. That side of the argument won.
Mm-hmm.
There is alternative opportunities for people. There is a way to treat inflammation or other things without having to have it being a medicine or a shot like that. But I'm going to think about that for next week.
Well,
when did that change come?
And here's something to sort of put a bug in your head or ear in terms of potentially thinking about that. And this is not even me putting forth like a super hot take. It's just me kind of like throwing out something that's potentially a possibility. There's no question that in recent years, the sort of larger corporations, Wall Street, so to speak, has kind of cozied up to some of those more Democrat-leaning candidates, right? Like, in other words, there's almost been a reversal of fortune where for the longest time, the pro-corporate party was definitely the GOP, was definitely the Republican Party, and the sort of more working class, rank and file was on the Democrat side.
Right.
But that populist movement that we've seen emerge amongst MAGA, and ever since really the Tea Party maybe, has kind of pushed things the other way and made it so that there's more corporate interests aligned with the Democrats and some of these, more populist ideals amongst the Republicans. So I don't know. Is it just the fact that Big Pharma is helping to advance some of that Democrat agenda? And that's where this is like, thou shalt not question any of these vaccines because the check clears when Pfizer's writing it to the DNC.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, when I was in office, I never even thought about getting checks from any of those companies. Now, Pfizer was a company that kind of moved in that direction. It's the first time I think I recognized it. And I went to some Pfizer event, and they said, well, let me know when you're having something. And I did, and they were supportive. I don't think they agreed with everything I did, but, they liked the relationship. Now, it is interesting because it's hard to figure out who's on whose team these days.
Sure. And I think that if I'm being frank about it, I'm not somebody that's super anti-pharma, right? Like, I think that as someone on the right who's not really super in favor of socialized medicine and, diluting the quality of care by making it so that everybody gets the same grayish low level or mid level of care.
Right.
I have nothing against investing in pharmaceuticals and trying to find new treatments and come up with new drugs that are going to have a profit margin. And I'm fine with that. But the problem is the more it gets into this dogmatic, thou shalt not question,
right,
that's when my libertarian flag goes up. And I think that's where I'm still here on the right kind of saying, wait a second.
Your libertarian flag will stay up when what really happened with some of those major companies is that as much as they sometimes even put money into trying to, divert the public's interest from alternative ways of conducting their health care,
right,
that a lot of those products worked. And when they started working, there were situations where the original companies, the big pharma type companies, they went in and used part of the alternative product. So, for instance, melatonin, that was always, argued severely against by the, the people
making sleeping pills and stuff.
Exactly. And so then what they did was they came out with a product in the 90s, Melatonex, and they made money off of it.
Yep. Ain't that America, Governor Paterson? Absolutely true. Okay, so look, talking a lot about bird flu, measles, and COVID here in this segment. Well, up next, we're going to talk a little bit about masks. And why masks? Well, because those protesters, if you want to call them that, up at Columbia University, continuing to wear those masks. And Governor Hochul doesn't seem to want to get rid of them. Is it because of COVID? Not so sure about that. He's Governor David Paterson on the left. I'm James Flippin here on the right, 77 WABC.
It's the left versus the right. It's a 77 WABC debate. 77 WABC.
And welcome back to the left versus the right. Governor David Paterson sitting across from me here representing the political left. And here on the political right, I'm James Flippin, 77 WABC. So, Governor, more of the same here with these protests against Israel, pro-Palestine up at Barnard College, Columbia University. Are you surprised at this point that this is continuing to be the push from the university subculture to kind of be super pro-Palestine and anti-Israel? Or are you saying, no, this is kind of the status quo these days?
I am sadly surprised. I didn't think it would get like this. And, today's the first day of March, so we're just getting into the spring months when it's warmer. It could get worse.
Oh, yeah.
But I thought last year that perhaps this was a little bit of piling on. In other words, after the strong support that came out for the Jewish communities around the United States and, of course, for Israel and everything that happened on October 7th, that this was kind of a reaction of it and that younger people who, would be looking to protest something anyway, came out and did that. And at Columbia got really bad at certain points. But the fact that it's raising its ugly head again this year and earlier in the year, I find unseemly and disturbing. It is, I don't know what it is.
Why is it such a cause célèbre amongst the younger left-leaning political people to be against Israel? I mean, you've heard it all before, right? Apartheid, occupation, colonizers, anti-Islam, genocide. I mean, where do you think that took root, and what do you think is the future for that kind of movement?
Well, none of those activities involve them. In other words, they weren't the victims. They may have read about things, and I'm not saying
You're talking about the college students.
The college students, and I'm not saying that Israel's always right.
Sure.
Or that I haven't disagreed with a couple of things I've seen Israel do.
Which I think is fair, by the way, and I'll say that as the member of the right or whatever.
Yeah, but, I mean, where's the humanity when you have this type of scheduled explosion a year and a half ago and people killed, maimed, people kidnapped, then killed while they were in custody. Then they bring the bodies out like they weren't killed, lying about who some of the victims were, setting deadlines for a release and then not doing it. And you don't have a problem with any of these people? I worry, I think, more about some of our own than them.
Why? Do you think that there's anything other than, I'm going to put it to you in really frank terms, because this is kind of the way I look at it, right? I think that there's any number of really decent, honest, thorough, and probing discussions that you could have about the Israeli-Arab conflict and find good arguments on both sides for why things have been this way or that way. And, again, we talk about stuff that's going back thousands of years. You could even go back to the end of World War II and the way the Levant was divided up and the way that, Britain and France and the U.S. were supposed to have their respective roles in this whole thing and what did or didn't happen. But in terms of what it is right now, to me, the only explanation for the young people's anti-Israel position, pro-Palestine position, and that's, again, just saying as a qualifier that I think the conflict goes deeper than that. In other words, you can be sort of against some of the things Israel does and not necessarily be anti-Semitic. But don't you think this is all just a lot of anti-Semitism from the people on the college campus? It's almost like they believed all this propaganda that's been put forth about the evil, greedy, rich, controlling all the media, like all the worst stereotypes that have been put forth and that have taken root in some way, I think, amongst these more Marxist thinkers to a large extent. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I remember I didn't know what anti-Semitism was.
Which is, I mean, look, this is a guy, you grew up in New York, the governor of New York, which other than California and Florida, I guess there's nowhere that comes even close in terms of the amount of Jews. Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead.
I grew up in Hempstead, Long Island. I had to go there because the New York City public school system wouldn't take me. We talked about that. And where I went to school, I would say was about 40% Jewish and then different other groups. And there was an Italian kid who on the playground, there was an argument, and he punched this friend of mine in the face and called him a dirty Jew. And our fourth grade teacher, who was black, interestingly enough, she stopped the whole class, and she had like a 2-hour session on respect.
Wow.
And that kind of thing.
And you remember that still to this day?
I remember that to this day. Now, what was interesting, James, is I ran into the friend of mine like 10 years ago. We went out, we had dinner, we talked about the old times. And I said to him, when you had that fight with that guy, I always heard his family was mob connected. I thought he beat you. And my friend said, it could have been worse. I could have beat him.
Now you can't leave.
Yeah, exactly. But that's, I mean, where does it start? I just never can honestly tell you that I think I've had biased opinions at times. I think I've held some other ethnicities more accountable than maybe I was being on my own. But I just don't ever remember meeting someone and have a visceral reaction like, oh, why do we have people like this in America?
I'm going to be honest with you, Governor. It's kind of just baffling to me. I mean, I know that it's something that has been around for almost at this point, like as long as human civilization, right? This whole idea that the Jewish population is like working in cahoots with each other and that they're all on the same page and it's some grand movement and all this kind of stuff. It belies the way humans actually move, work, think, and live. Yeah. And I just don't get it. I don't understand. It's almost like there's a desire among some people, because the world's so complicated and because it's so messy and because it's so harsh, to be able to have this one unifying factor. Like, yes, there is a bad guy. Yes, there is a boogeyman. And we can identify it, right? And I think that in the past, because you make a really good point, maybe we've all allowed ourselves to do that, right? Like I've often said, yeah, I am really harsh on Islam, for example, because I see it being, in my mind, oftentimes very violent in an outsized way.
Absolutely.
And the whole aspects of Sharia law and how I don't think that jives with Western civilization and whatever. I know there's a lot of other people who, again, we talked about it this segment, feel the same way about Judaism and the way that it interacts with Christianity and Islam and whatever. And then, of course, we don't have to get into other people who are just racist or kind of, bigoted in some other way for a different reason. But the aspect of the anti-Semitism on college campuses is kind of nothing short of extremely frustrating to me, because I feel like everybody wants to make it out to be a more interesting intellectual discussion. And it's like, no, these people just really actually believe what they've been radicalized to believe in a sort of Marxist way, that the usurious interest rates and the greed and the avarice and the real estate, and they buy it hook, line, and sinker, that somehow the Jewish person down the street is basically the reason for all of society's ills.
And at the same time, James, 65% of the white people who went down south during Dr. King's marches in Selma and that kind of place were Jewish. 65%. And at the time, what percentage of the population were they? Probably 2%.
Yep.
And going out of their way to help others or to do different things like that.
Right.
There was a situation where one of the schools where I grew up was segregated. It wasn't segregated by choice, but no African Americans or anyone else lived in that area. So they set up this program where about 9 or 10 of us went to that neighborhood to go to school. The first kids that invited us over? The Jewish kids. Every time.
Mm-hmm.
Every time.
Yeah.
And these are things that, for some reason, get lost in the conversation. And it's how do you come to such strong, boisterous opinions when you're 17 or 18, you're just going to college?
Yeah. It's a great, well, you know what, Governor, and I think maybe this is an answer in a way. It's the way that we can try to, because, look, this summer I turned 40, so I feel like I'm getting to that age now where I can be like, oh, these kids back in my day, you know what I mean? I can start to say that kind of thing. So, no, but I mean, we could all remember, right, what it is to be 17, 18 and going to college, and you think you know everything. You know what I mean? You think that the world's really laid out very, very easily on a silver platter, and the strength of your convictions and your passions and your confidence almost just kind of fuel that idea that the world's easy to understand. Right? So it is kind of a situation that I think there's always been maybe that sort of super passionate, I know everything position from young people. But unfortunately, in this instance, it's getting caught up in a sort of generations, thousands-year-old conflict that is really not so cut and dried.
Yes, and it's really diminishing the capacity of our country to come together. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean come together on a political point of view, just to come together, to be able to interact with each other and work together, do business together, have a good time together, the whole thing. I think we may be able to do Thanksgiving this year, James.
Yes. And
I think things have kind of slowed down a little bit.
You know what? And that's something that I find especially heartening is that when we come together, Governor Paterson, even though, technically speaking, it's a Democrat and a Republican, a black guy and a white guy, a New York guy
You're
and a
white?
New Jersey guy. Oh, breaking news here on 77 WABC.
No. I don't see very well.
Well, you know what? We're going to take it out to Staten Island next. Take away the left and the right, bring it to Vinny Modugno and the music here on 77 WABC. For Governor Paterson, I'm James Flippin.
Donate now to Toys for Tots, working year-round. Go to toysfortots.org. Toys for Tots supports children in need throughout the year with programs like the Toys for Tots Literacy Program. Established in 2008, has provided over 60 million books to disadvantaged children. The Toys for Tots Literacy Program is committed to providing disadvantaged children with direct access to books and educational resources that enhance their ability to read and communicate effectively. Go to toysfortots.org.